issues a rare rebuke to claims from former President Trump about the search at his Florida estate.
We have to look at every angle and every approach we can to stand with the Jewish people and stand with Israel in their time of great need.
This is the first state visit by an African head of state in nearly 20 years. It is long overdue.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. A new phase of pretrial activity got underway today in former President Trump's federal classified documents case in Florida. And while we await closing arguments in the criminal hush money and election interference trial in New York, former president is turning his ire from the judge presiding over that case, Juan Merchan, to the FBI. On his social media platform, Trump has accused, without any foundation, FBI agents of being, quote, locked and loaded, unquote, as they seized classified documents from his estate. The FBI issued a rare public rebuke to these claims, saying it followed normal, standard protocol, as it does for all search warrants, and that no one ordered additional steps be taken. Robert Costa joins us now from Studio 57 in New York. Robert, put a button on this. Clearly, the former president is saying something that isn't true. And as I understand it, there's plenty of evidence that the FBI went to extraordinary lengths to sort of make sure they had pre-negotiated their arrival at Mar-a-Lago and to sort of downplay the FBI presence there.
Major, your summary assessment is spot on based on our reporting here at CBS News. And the FBI did take that rare opportunity to offer clarity about the search. It rarely speaks up in instances like these, with an ongoing trial looming on the horizon, an active investigation still in some respects. But former President Trump's response to the FBI, his characterization of the search, is part of a broader effort by the former president as he seeks the White House once again to use grievance against a perceived legal establishment, the federal government, to generate support among his core voters across the country.
And it also seemed to be a diversionary effort because some of the things that were released yesterday indicate that a very senior federal judge reviewing the evidence presented found more than enough evidence not only behind the search warrant itself, but by a highly unusual request that lawyer-client privilege be pierced in this matter. True?
That's exactly right, Major. You're seeing here in this particular case on the federal level a real emphasis by federal investigators to understand whether former President Trump had criminal intent when he decided to keep all of these documents at his home in Mar-a-Lago. And as they have pursued this investigation over the course of recent years, they have gone to great lengths to try to find out more about the deliberations between Trump and his lead attorney in the case, Evan Corcoran, to pierce attorney-client privilege in some ways, to try to better understand what was Trump doing behind the scenes, why did he hold on to these documents, and what did he do, allegedly, to direct certain people in his organization, working at Mar-a-Lago, working on his campaign, to in some way deal with these documents.
Not only the documents themselves, but allegations of possible obstruction of justice. Robert, I also want to ask you a political question. Here in Washington, mere moments ago, Nikki Haley, in a speech on foreign policy, added this line: I'm going to vote for Trump. Any reaction from the Trump world? Your assessment, does this come as a surprise?
It does not come as a surprise in the sense that while Nikki Haley, the former UN ambassador, was a critic of the former president during her own presidential campaign, she is someone who did serve in his administration, and she never drew stark lines morally, politically, ethically when it came to the former president. She is not former Representative Liz Cheney. She is not former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, who see Trump as a bridge too far, someone they just can't get around. Haley is someone who has worked with Trump and is now signaling she might not join the next administration should Trump win. But she is a traditional Republican voice. And like many of them, they may not love Trump. They might have preferred Haley was the nominee. Haley, of course, wishes she was the nominee. But at the same time, they see him as the standard bearer, and they know the Republican voters are with Trump.
Robert Costa, New York. As always, we thank you.
Thank you.
House Speaker Mike Johnson is moving ahead with plans to ask Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to address Congress. Johnson said a letter inviting the Prime Minister to do just that will go out this week. Scott McFarland joins us now from Capitol Hill. Scott, tell us about this letter to invite the Prime Minister to speak. What's about the timing and the politics that may be behind it?
It picked up some momentum today, Major, before it finally made its way through this unofficial parliamentary process. The Congress is out next week for the Memorial Day holiday, so this is something that's truly going to be a summer event at the Capitol. I can tell you this, in a location, in a place where heads of state regularly appear and regularly visit, those visits are usually mundane affairs. This will not be. This is an anticipated address to a Congress that has been grappling with how and what to fund Israel with amid the war in Gaza. I can tell you the resistance to this has been tepid. There have been some concerns among some progressives, but we heard from the House Democratic Caucus chair today, Major, and he was asked point blank, do Democrats support this on the whole? And he said he has not been hearing any large-scale mobilized resistance.
Democrats are on Capitol Hill, as I understand it, Scott, reacting to comments former President Trump made yesterday in an interview with one of our CBS stations in Pittsburgh, KDKA, about contraception and access to that in a possible Trump administration. What are you hearing?
The former president, in that interview with CBS Pittsburgh, didn't close the door on future restrictions at some level of government on contraceptives if he wins the White House again. That has, in a very quick sequence of events, led Senate Democrats to plan a vote on a bill that would federally protect access to contraceptives. Now, this is a law that would not become law because it wouldn't get the 60 votes it needs. Republicans wouldn't be openly defying former President Trump on the Senate floor. But this is an argument Democrats are spoiling to have 6 months until an election in which they want to raise the profile of reproductive rights as an issue. One of those Senate Democrats, Brian Schatz of Hawaii, explained why he thinks this type of bill is necessary.
I think they have demonstrated through their Supreme Court justice appointments what they want to do. And what they want to do is take away all of the freedoms that women have been taking for granted for the last several decades. The ability to start a family, the ability to determine when you want to start a family, those are fundamental, basic human rights, and they're being taken away by the Trump court.
Major, as you know, it's unclear what type of message June votes have come November, but it's certainly something that they can campaign on as the election grows closer.
Scott, catch us up on what's happening this week in terms of immigration and the debate in the Senate and how it's landing even within the Democratic caucus.
Speaking of bills that won't pass, the U.S. Senate tomorrow has a second crack at this border security bill that they first proposed on a bipartisan basis back in February. More border agents, more border security technology, better equipment, something that both parties came together with as part of that effort in February to also pass Ukraine and Israel funding. The Senate Democrats put this up, just the border components, again tomorrow. They know they're going to hemorrhage Republican votes. They're going to likely lose a few of their own votes among Democrats, but they do want to amplify this message that Democrats were caught trying on issues involving the border and issues involving immigration as we get closer to November. Some of this leads right up to campaign commercials in October for those embattled Senate Democrats from Pennsylvania to Wisconsin, Nevada to Montana to Ohio. But, Major, some of this might require a political compass and protractor or assumes independent voters are watching C-SPAN on a beautiful Thursday afternoon back home.
Always want to keep my compass and protractor handy. Scott McFarland from Capitol Hill. As always, we thank you.
How will they cheat? How will the Democrats cheat in Pennsylvania?
About 12 different ways. So many ways. If you had all day, I could give you examples.
Despite losing the state by more than 80,000 votes, former President Trump still insists falsely that he won Pennsylvania 4 years ago. When we come back, we'll speak with CBS News Pittsburgh Jon Delano about his interview with Trump. You are streaming America Decides.
Do you support any restrictions on a person's right to contraception?
Well, we're looking at that, and I'm going to have a policy on that very shortly.
Well, that suggests that you may want to support some restrictions, like the morning after pill or something.
We are also, things really do have a lot to do with the states, and some states are going to have different policies than others.
That was former President Trump this week telling CBS News Pittsburgh that he would be open to restricting access to birth control if reelected. Following that interview, however, the former president wrote on his social media platform that he has never and never will advocate for restricting birth control or contraceptives and the access thereto. CBS News Pittsburgh politics editor Jon Delano, who interviewed the former president, joins us now. John, you did exactly what reporters are supposed to do. You ask questions in the moment. The former president clearly understood them. He made news and then tried to back away from the very news he made. What do you make of that?
Well, first, thank you, Major. It's always good to be with you. And I apologize. I have a cold, so I know I don't sound great. But
sound great to me, John. Go ahead.
If the former president had given the tweet that he later came out with as a response to my first question, this question would have gone nowhere. But it was because he suggested that there was a policy in the making in which he was reviewing the various abilities to restrict contraceptives that led to my second question, which was simply that it sounds like you're trying to go someplace else. And then when he responded by saying there could well be a state-by-state solution, I knew that was unconstitutional. There's a Supreme Court case called Griswold versus Connecticut from 1965, which basically said states could not prohibit contraception. It's a zone of privacy that all individuals have. And unless the Supreme Court were to overturn that case, no matter what President Trump says, it would be difficult, I think, to go that way. But he was clearly indicating, at least in his responses to me, that he was open to the possibility of state-by-state limitations on contraception.
Yeah, when someone who is a candidate for office, former president of the United States, says he has a policy and development on that, it indicates he is at least at some level open to it, regardless of whatever he posted later on his social media platform. You also, John, discussed the possibility of a 15-week federal abortion ban. Let's listen to the former president's response.
If Congress passes a 15-week bill, you'd veto it.
I don't think there'd be any reason for it because all the states are going to have their own. It's very interesting. All of the states now, we just got out of the federal government. They couldn't pass anything. Congress couldn't pass, the Senate couldn't pass, and it's really not up to Congress. It's up to, a whole group of people beyond Congress.
Major, the context for that is important because Pennsylvania allows an abortion up until the 24th week. Now, if the former president is saying Pennsylvania is entitled to its own rules, depending on its legislature and governor, that's one thing. But if the federal government through Congress were allowed to restrict that to 15 weeks or even 6 weeks, and President Trump, if reelected, was going to sign that bill, that would have a huge impact on 12+ million Pennsylvanians. So that's why I asked that question. In fact, all my questions relate to Pennsylvania because obviously I'm a Pennsylvania journalist.
Precisely, John, and one of the best statewide. Is it your sense that this is an issue that will resonate and continues to resonate in Pennsylvania as it does in other battleground states?
And no question about it. I think that the whole issue of abortion and abortion restrictions, reproductive rights, is a very big issue, particularly in the suburbs of both Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And those are the two major media markets in the state. If President Biden does well in those areas, particularly in the suburbs, it makes it very difficult for former President Trump to win re-election. So this issue, the Democrats are doing everything they can to make this an issue, including really highlighting the former president's responses to my questions yesterday. They've got it all over their websites, believe me.
No doubt. And John, it's worth pointing out these are historic times. A former president of the United States, for the first time in our republic's history, is under trial under a criminal indictment in New York. You discussed the trial, its possible implications with the former president. Let's listen to that.
Do you think the outcome, whether acquitted or guilty, has any impact on voters in Pennsylvania?
I think it has no impact at all. I think it has been driving up. This trial is a rigged trial with a judge who's a crooked judge and a conflicted judge, highly conflicted. He went crazy yesterday because the witness was so good for me. And it's a very rigged situation. The public has seen it.
So, John, do you think the president is on to something, at least in Pennsylvania, as you understand it, with voter reaction to the proceedings in New York?
Well, I think he may be. I'm not sure people are paying much attention to this trial. And I think his supporters are certainly going to be with him no matter what. So, yes, I think that he's probably right in terms of his analysis of Pennsylvania. But it remains to be seen, and we don't know whether he's guilty, not guilty, or a mistrial.
And, of course, pollsters will tell you it's impossible to poll on what people might think about an outcome that they don't have in front of them quite yet. Jon Delano, you soldiered through your cold. You put together a great news-making interview. As always, it's a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Major. Great to be with you, too.
A judge has approved Hunter Biden's request to delay the start of his federal tax trial. That trial was set to begin next month, but it's now scheduled to begin September 5th. Hunter Biden has pleaded not guilty for failing to pay nearly $1.5 million in taxes over a 4-year span. The president's son also has pleaded not guilty in Delaware to lying about his drug use when buying a gun in 2018. A different judge on Tuesday denied Hunter Biden's request to delay that federal trial, which is now scheduled to begin on June 3rd. President Biden has welcomed Kenya's president to the White House. We've got a preview of what's on the agenda for the first African state visit in more than 15 years. You are streaming America Decides. President Biden has welcomed Kenya's president to the White House for a 3-day state visit. William Ruto is the first leader of an African country to receive the honor of a state visit since 2008. The two leaders will hold formal talks, of course, and conduct a joint news conference tomorrow before tomorrow evening's state dinner. Back in 2022, Biden promised to visit Africa, but other priorities and obligations have since gotten in the way, including the Israel-Hamas war and an ongoing, long-fought legislative battle to renew funding for Ukraine. Weijia Jiang joins us now from the White House. Weijia, why is this particular state visit prominent and important on the president's schedule?
Well, Major, the president literally rolled out the red carpet for the president of Kenya for a variety of reasons. One, as you mentioned, he was supposed to go to Africa last year. It was a promise and a promise broken. And he really wants to show that the U.S. values relationships with the country there, not only for its own purposes, which, of course, the president talked about, partnerships with regard to climate change and technology. In fact, they met with tech executives. But, Major, every time we are talking about this president's foreign policy, you can't not talk about China. And in recent years, especially, Beijing has invested tens of billions of dollars into Africa to try to bolster that relationship. And the U.S. recognizes that. And so because this is another level of competition with China that has very clear aspirations on the world stage, it is important for the U.S. to try to match at least this courtship, which is why we are seeing this 3-day visit from the president of Kenya.
Speaking of aspirations today, Norway, Ireland, and Spain formally recognized a Palestinian state. I say aspiration because it is an aspirational entity. A Palestinian state does not yet exist. How did the Biden administration respond?
Well, the administration, including the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, says that it is up to every country to make this decision. But certainly in a statement, the president expressed dismay without doing so explicitly, saying that he believes that a Palestinian state should be realized through direct negotiations between the parties and not through unilateral recognition. And that is because the U.S. has really been trying to broker a broader peace deal, not only between Israel and Palestine, but to try to normalize relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And there's a big question about what happens when more and more countries, especially allies of the U.S., continue to recognize Palestine as a state. And Jake Sullivan acknowledged today that the U.S. has concerns, he said, that Israel seems to be becoming more and more isolated, and that the administration has expressed to the Israeli government that that is worrisome when it comes to its ultimate security in the future. Major.
Weijia Jiang at the White House. Thank you very much. Former presidential candidate Nikki Haley announces she will be voting for former President Trump this November. We will check in with our Nydia Cavazos next for more on what Haley had to say. You are streaming America Decides.
Biden has been a catastrophe. So I will be voting for Trump. Having said that, I stand by what I said in my suspension speech. Trump would be smart to reach out to the millions of people who voted for me and continue to support me, and not assume that they're just going to be with him.
News and campaign advice. That was former presidential candidate Nikki Haley throwing her support behind former President Trump. Haley revealed this after delivering a foreign policy speech here in Washington at a think tank called the Hudson Institute. Nydia Cavazos joins us now. Nydia, what do we know, what do we know about the evolution of this statement and anything it might mean for Nikki Haley's suspended campaign and the delegates she won during the Republican primaries and caucuses?
Major, what we do know so far today is that Nikki Haley has officially come out to say she is supporting former President Donald Trump as a voter, although this isn't necessarily a formal endorsement as a former presidential candidate. She has come out to say that she will be voting for the former president here. Now, she did stop short of this official endorsement, but she also did call out Trump and asked him to reach out to her supporters and to her voters so that they can earn his support when it comes to this upcoming election.
And what did Nikki Haley have to say, if anything, about President Biden and his approach to foreign policy? I'm sure she had some choice words.
But when it came to the speech that we first heard, and again, this is the first official speech that we hear from Nikki Haley after she dropped out of the presidential race almost 2 months ago, she did mention President Biden over 18 times in her speech today. And all of this was to denounce his actions, to denounce his responses to the Israel and Hamas conflict. But she also officially blames him for putting the country at risk by, she named several examples, for example, by withholding weapons from Israel just a couple of weeks ago. And she also further blames Biden for putting the country at risk by not necessarily tackling the U.S. southern border.
I believe we have some sound from that speech. Control, is that right? And if we do, please roll that.
I can hardly imagine a more foolish move than Joe Biden withholding weapons from one of our closest allies. And it comes after more and more Democrats have turned on Israel.
Nydia, do we expect more visibility from Nikki Haley after this, or is this kind of a one-time only thing?
We can certainly expect more from Nikki Haley in the upcoming weeks. She will be working closely with the Hudson Institute. And again, her focus is going to be on foreign policy. Now, what we heard today was very similar to what we had been hearing from Haley throughout the campaign trail across various states in the country. And her message today remains very similar, which is she's sending a warning that if the president and who ends up leading the country in November doesn't necessarily tackle Russia, China, Iran, then the country would fall at risk. And this is why she has continuously been expressing the need to support allies, which includes Israel and Ukraine. And again, in one of her speeches today, she also denounced Republicans in Congress for failing to act on this. As she says, any aid that's sent is not necessarily a foreign aid, but it is rather an investment in the country's peace.
Nydia Cavazos, thanks so much. I want to bring in our political strategist panel. Mara Gillespie and Chuck Rocha join us now. Mara served as an advisor to former House Speaker John Boehner and Congressman Adam Kinzinger. Chuck served as a senior advisor to Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign. Mara, let me start with you. Surprised, not surprised, Nikki Haley?
I'm surprised because I don't necessarily understand why you have to go out and tell everyone who you're voting for. I don't think it's required. No one needs to know that you're choosing between the two and who you choose. So I am surprised. I don't know what the benefit is to coming out and having this announcement. I know it's not an endorsement, but is it not?
Most voters will not understand the technical difference.
I agree with you. And I think that is a disservice to her supporters who have been pretty vocal in the primaries recently. Even though she's been out of the race, they still continue to vote for her. So what message does it send to them?
And from your vantage point, Mara, is that a meaningful statistical matter that in Indiana, Maryland, other places, Nikki Haley having suspended her campaign nearly 2 months ago, still clocks 18 to 20% in these essentially non-contested primaries. Does that mean something to you?
It does, because it shows us that, again, we knew this going into this before Donald Trump was the nominee, but that people didn't want this rematch of Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. They're still telling us that, especially Republicans who are dissatisfied with their choices and wanting to have somebody else to look to. You know, Nikki Haley, sure, if she was going to vote for Trump, that's great. You don't need to tell everyone that. You also have this option. It's called a write-in. You can do that as well. So I don't know that I don't know that this really does move the needle for the Nikki Haley voters. Maybe for some of them it does, but I still think they're going to be questioning what happened here and what's really the motivation behind it. Chuck, is she running for VP? I don't know.
Well, let me pick up on that. About a week ago, Chuck, as you know, there was one story that Nikki Haley was under consideration. And within an hour on his social media platform, former President Trump said, no, she's not. Do you think in any way, shape, or form this might change that calculation?
I don't think it changes it. And I think Nikki Haley wants to be the president in 2028. And that's why you saw her do what she did today.
Right.
I am not a lobbyist.
This is a long-term play.
This is a political move. And when you want to talk about politics, I've been doing politics for 34 years. She wants to be the president. She's young. She's dynamic. She got a lot of support. She's still getting 20%, to your point, of people voting for her. And she ain't even running on the ticket. Like, now,
spending no money, doing nothing.
Absolutely. And that's a problem in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona. I know we'll get to that. But I don't think all of those people flock to Joe Biden. I'm not stupid. But I think that if enough of them skip that part of the top of the ballot or a little bit of support to Joe Biden, it goes a long way.
So I want to ask you from your vantage point, Chuck, this week, former President Trump completely mangled a message on contraceptives and access. Someone associated with this campaign posted a video that said something about a unified Reich. Long term, which is more politically problematic for the former president?
Anything to have to do with a woman's body. You saw Democrats win on that in 2022. It's a powerful message. Any of us who spend any time around a woman in our lives know that there's one thing you don't do, and you don't mess with a woman. And that's exactly what he's doing. Sure, the Reich stuff falls in line with all the other things that he says that folks say is anti-American or authoritarian. But talking about a woman's freedom to do what she wants to do with her body is him just reinforcing a narrative that Democrats will use over and over to mobilize women around this country.
There's a Bloomberg story today written by Joshua Green that says focus groups are detecting and have detected for like the last month or so swing voters alarmed about this idea about what former President Trump's actual attitudes are about a third term, or would there be another election, or threat to democracy. Do you think that is still a resonant issue for Democrats? And do you believe stories that talk about swing voters and focus groups volunteering concerns about that?
I do believe that, and I do focus groups all the time. It's how much of his stuff can you use? As a political consultant, he overwhelms you. He floods the zone. It's like drinking out of a water hydrant. It's like, how do you pick a piece out of everything that's coming at you to use? And you'll watch Democrats, they will defer back to this choice issue and women issue a lot more than they'll look at the democracy, but they will use that, and they'll use that to their betterment.
Maura, your perspective on that question I just put to Chuck.
I would agree with Chuck there. I think that when it comes to women's health and women's reproductive rights, Republicans will lose time and time again unless they change their message, and they're not going to. We just saw that, yes, putting it to the states is one thing, but then being wishy-washy on whether or not you actually support women's reproductive rights, and half the population are women, and telling them they don't get medical freedom, that's not going to sit well with them. Whether they're vocal about it or not, they will be vocal at the ballot box. So they've got to consider that. And then to the other point, the democracy question. It's not like Donald Trump voters didn't know who he was going into 2016. They knew who he was. 2020, they knew who he was.
They knew who he was in 2020.
Absolutely. They know who he is and who he wants to be. None of that is new. Whether it doesn't make it right, what he says, and it doesn't make it okay, it's grotesque and horrible, but they know who he is, and he wants to aspire to be a dictator, right? But he doesn't want the actual job of being president. He wants to be in power. But I think when it comes to questions about democracy and women's health is where the Nikki Haley voters, those who are undecided and unhappy with the choices, that's where you might get them.
To your point a moment ago about Trump saying, well, the states will decide. Tactically, he gives off the impression that sort of insulates him from this larger debate. But as we saw in Alabama, and as we may soon see in Louisiana, what states do about access to either IVF in Alabama or mifepristone and misoprostol in Louisiana, morning after drugs, can become an instant national issue.
You're criminalizing women for taking control of what happens to their bodies. That's what you're doing with those decisions. You're criminalizing them for having an active role in what's best for their health, what's best for them, without having any ideas or suggestions or resources to help them. You know, we focus so much on, we don't want this, but what will you do after the fact? You're telling women in Louisiana, you're telling women that they have to have these children. Well, how are you supporting them? What are they supposed to do? It's costly to have kids. It's costly to go through every appointment to make sure you're having a healthy pregnancy. But if you're preventing them from having the care and access that they need, where does it leave them?
Chuck, real quickly, does it insulate Trump strategically by saying, oh, the states will take care of it, don't ask me too much?
I think people will see through it. And Democratic strategists like me will take what happened in Louisiana and will make it and tie it around a Republican's neck anywhere that they are running, saying, this is your party, this is what your party stands for. Folks have been doing that for a long time and will continue to.
Chuck Rocha and Mara, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. Republican National Committee headquarters here in Washington was placed on lockdown ever so briefly this morning after 2 vials of blood were found in a suspicious package delivered there. No one was hurt. Capitol Police, of course, is looking into where this package came from. In a statement, the RNC sought to tie this particular incident to, quote, the extreme left, but authorities have not yet released information about a possible motive or source.
The shameful equivalence implied between Hamas and the leadership of Israel, I think that only complicates the prospects for getting such an agreement.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken takes aim at the International Criminal Court, why the Biden administration is slamming the court's arrest warrant request for Benjamin Netanyahu. You are streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was on Capitol Hill today where he urged international partners to, quote, do everything they can, unquote, to expedite aid deliveries into Gaza. CBS News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent and the moderator of Face the Nation, Margaret Brennan, joins me here on the set. Great to see you, Margaret. I want to talk to you also about something that the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said at the White House briefing today, emphasizing the administration's push to increase the flow and the reliability of the flow of aid into Gaza. Let's listen.
Aid is flowing. It is not flowing at the rate that any of us would be happy with because we always want more. But we are actually seeing good cooperation between the U.S., the IDF, the UN, and other humanitarian organizations to ensure that aid goes from that pier to innocent people in need, and we'll continue to do that as we go forward.
Margaret, status check. Where are we on this?
Flowing might be generous
Yeah.
because over the weekend, as you know, the World Food Program, which is overseeing the delivery from the pier to the actual distribution to the people, actually had to shut down some of the distribution because they had trucks raided by starving people, by also perhaps criminal elements mixed in there. But this issue of delivery, it has been the most central and most difficult thing when it comes to aid for weeks. And it has been one of the hardest parts of this to negotiate. But to be clear, backing this up to the question of the pier that the U.S. is defending from the White House podium, it is inefficient, it is insufficient to need. There's only something like 7 trucks worth of aid delivered off of a pier. It is far more efficient to have the flow through those land gates with additional deliveries, far more efficient also than dropping things from the sky.
Right. And what is the status of those land delivery areas, which the Israelis, for various reasons, and they have changed the justification over time, continue to either block, intercept, or slow?
Well, Jake Sullivan said today that there were 695 metric tons of food being delivered. I think those were off the pier going to a warehouse. And then it's the, okay, and then?
And then what?
And then
right.
what? But for those land entries, what we know is that at this moment in time, particularly since that IDF encirclement of Rafah in southern Gaza, those gateways that had been opened following President Biden's pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu then were closed. And that is not just the Israeli issue, that's also an Egyptian issue and somewhat of a Palestinian issue. And you heard Secretary Blinken get pressed on this today before Congress when he was testifying. And he very diplomatically said, well, the Egyptians are being great partners, but it would be great if they could do more. Some of what they were closing off on their side of the border was due to their frustration that the Israeli government sent its troops into Rafah. So they were protesting it. And from aid workers that I've talked to, they said, fine, protest it, but don't deny starving people food. On the IDF part of it, some of it is also just the logistics of moving people, aid workers, through areas that are contested. And
right. Combat zones.
A combat zone. And you put IDF soldiers in there, you are going to also draw in Hamas fighters shooting at them and vice versa. So if you have to put in non-combatants in the midst of that, it's also highly dangerous. So this is a really complicated operation, and there is day-to-day pressure being brought by the Biden administration. But this brings you to those bigger debates and conversations about whether there's deliberate withholding of aid, whether there has been, at the government levels higher than the folks on the ground, decisions to make it more difficult. And we've seen explicit statements from some Israeli government ministers.
When pressed on this very question on CNN yesterday by Jake Tapper, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said, well, we deliver aid. We're very much in favor of that, but Hamas steals it or siphons it. I'm sure that is, in some respects, true. Is it totally the story?
No.
What is our visibility on that key question?
Well, the Israeli Prime Minister has said throughout that there is no obstruction on his government's part. However, if that were true, then he would not have taken power away from the ministers who were controlling aid access, some of them the more far-right nationalist ministers within his government, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. They were blocking at one point delivery of U.S. taxpayer-funded flour. So one of the things that happened after that phone call President Biden made that, as we all know, was very heavily publicized as a tough one a few weeks ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu took control from those ministers and said he would now play a direct role in overseeing aid operations. So if it was all fine and dandy, then come on. So, and you wouldn't have a famine in northern Gaza to the degree that you do now. Now, does that mean there aren't criminal elements? Absolutely not. And U.S. officials have said that. It's not just Hamas. There are also criminal elements. You also have crowds of starving people. There's a lot of exploitation that is happening there. And the scarcity only makes it more of a profit-making incentive for some of these criminal enterprises to take food.
And very briefly, Margaret, the Israeli Prime Minister also talking to CNN sort of downplayed the idea of starvation or famine, like it's not really a real thing. What do we know?
It's a real thing. And we have had numerous people tell us some of the most horrific detail on our program on Face the Nation, whether it was the head of Doctors Without Borders, the head of Save the Children, the head of UNICEF. We have talked to people on the ground, the Scott Peterson, who runs UNRWA, a U.S. Army vet who is on the ground there, saying that they do not have food and water to meet the number of people they have. I have spoken to people who have left Gaza, who have told me that. And you are seeing that also, by the way, if you want to read the State Department report that was published under this national security memorandum that the president ordered, it detailed how severe the humanitarian deprivation had gotten. It also, by the way, mentioned ongoing Israeli court system investigations into criminal undertakings within the Israeli system.
Margaret Brennan, as always, thank you so much for your expertise and perspective. A controlled dangerous substance. The Louisiana House passes a bill to make that the new classification for 2 abortion pills. Where does this bill go from here? We will find out next. You are streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Thanks for staying with us. Louisiana State House has approved a bill that would add 2 commonly used abortion pills to the state's list of, quote, controlled dangerous substances, unquote. If this particular bill becomes law, Louisiana would be the first state to put mifepristone and misoprostol in the same category as highly addictive drugs like opioids. It would also make having the pills without a valid prescription punishable by fines and/or jail time. Let's bring in our Shauna Mizell. Shauna covers this issue for us, among many others. Shauna, walk us through what this law would do and the implications, at least within Louisiana, for access to reproductive health care.
Major, good evening. I think you outlined it pretty well. This bill would make mifepristol and mifepristone, controlled dangerous substances, but it must first go to the state Senate. It passed overwhelmingly in the state House in Louisiana. Now, in Louisiana, abortion is currently illegal, right? So with that being said, the impacts that it could have on reproductive rights wouldn't be as big as we would expect, but these two drugs are also used to manage miscarriages, and so preventing access to women who may need them could have wide-ranging health impacts.
And that's some of the debate going on in the legislature right now. I've read stories about doctors and health professionals saying this isn't just about abortion, it's about other adjacent healthcare issues, and if you criminalize this, you might limit access to it and therefore deprive people you're not intending to hurt from this potentially beneficial medication.
Yeah, the intention of this bill actually came from a state lawmaker in Louisiana who told the story of his sister, whose husband had crushed up some of these drugs, put them in water, and tried to force her to have an abortion without her consent. But as we've seen now, this caveat has been added related to making this a controlled substance that wasn't in the original bill, and that's why it's now going to head back to the Senate.
So the original intent was to criminalize something that would obviously, I think most people would find abhorrent. A couple having a very sharp disagreement about the future of their family, putting abortion medication unknowingly in a drink and causing an abortion without the other partner's consent. That's something I think most people would say, wait a minute, we should probably do something about. But now it's going into something much bigger.
Exactly, and now you've seen a big discord between Democrats and Republicans in the state, and you've also had national voices now joining and chiming in on this as well. You had Vice President Kamala Harris now tying this to former President Donald Trump, saying that this is his fault. But you also had the state's governor, who's a Republican and an opponent of abortion, responding to that criticism from Harris, saying, you know, you're doing something right when Vice President Kamala Harris is criticizing you.
Does that indicate the governor intends, if this bill gets to his desk, to sign it?
It seems so.
Very much. Shauna Mizell, thank you so very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Major.
In this week's edition of The Takeout, I sat down with the authors of a brand new book that digs deeply into the history and the rise of big lobbying here in Washington and big money in politics. Here is a part of that conversation. What is the secret history you tell in this book? What's the secret that people will learn?
The secret that we learned, twofold really. One is that companies have tremendous power in Washington today, and that they have no adversaries. Labor unions have no influence, environmental groups have no influence, consumer groups have no influence. So companies are really the only game in town. And so when members of Congress or policymakers make laws or legislation, they're only talking to companies, and companies therefore have tremendous influence on that legislation in ways that helps companies and helps corporate CEOs and doesn't help regular Americans.
But Luke, people say, wait a minute, we have Republicans and Democrats, we see them arguing all the time. Right. Is that just for show?
I mean, they are arguing, but you know, for about 4 decades, the sort of parameters of that argument was set in large part by the corporate.
The range of options was heavily influenced by corporations and corporate mentality.
Correct.
And bottom lines.
Correct.
And profits.
Yeah, I mean, we call it sort of this pro-business consensus that was sort of formed, you know, in the late 70s, and really we see kind of falling apart now.
You can watch my entire conversation with Luke and Brody Mullins, the authors of the new book, The Wolves of K Street, on The Takeout, starting this Sunday night at 10:30 p.m. Eastern. An American doctor who saved Senator Tammy Duckworth's life after she was shot down in Iraq in 2004 is now on his way home. Just last week, the Illinois senator told us about Dr. Adam Hamaway. He has been stuck in Gaza since Israeli troops blocked the Rafah border crossing. On Sunday, the senator made a direct appeal to the White House to help secure his release. Duckworth posted the good news on social media Tuesday, sharing that she was, quote, grateful to President Biden and urged, quote, more aid to innocents in Gaza. Well, that does it for today. We will be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.